There's a temptation to tell the story of cannabis prohibition like it was inevitable. Like America discovered a dangerous drug, panicked, and did what it had to do. But that's not what happened. The truth is messier and, honestly, more interesting. And because we may be on the cusp of rescheduling cannabis here in America, it's important to know how we got to where we are today. Before we continue, why not subscribe? We fire off one of these history videos every week. Now that we have that out of the way, settle in and spark one up, because it's time to go back in time. Cannabis didn't become illegal in the United States because of one scientific discovery or one sudden wave of public outrage. It became illegal the way a lot of things become normal in American life. Because laws got written, bureaucracies got built, careers got made, headlines got printed. And once the machinery was running, it didn't want to stop. This is the story of how cannabis prohibition was constructed, piece by piece, until it felt like it had always been there. Start at the beginning, and you find something surprising. For much of American history, cannabis simply wasn't treated like a national emergency. It existed on the margins, in medicines, in industrial hemp, in immigrant communities, in local policing problems that most of the country didn't think about at all. The earliest crackdowns weren't federal. They were local and state level. In the 1910s, some border and western communities began treating marijuana as a problem associated with migrants and social anxiety. And laws started appearing not because of a national consensus, but because it was politically easy to target a substance most Americans didn't understand. El Paso's early municipal crackdown culminated in a city ordinance in June 1915. And as the years moved on, more states experimented with restrictions and poison laws, often bundling cannabis alongside other drugs under broad public safety logic. That's the first key point. Cannabis wasn't discovered as a threat. It was categorized as one. And categorization is powerful, because once a drug is categorized as dangerous, you don't need to prove danger every time you pass a new law. The category does the work for you. Then comes the 1930s, the decade where the modern structure of prohibition really gets its spine. The federal government creates the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and it needs a mission. It needs a reason to exist, a reason to grow, a reason to be funded. Enter Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a man who would shape America's drug policy for decades. Here's where the story shifts from scattered local laws to national momentum. Because Anslinger didn't just enforce drug laws, he sold drug laws. He lobbied. He pushed model legislation. He cultivated media attention. He made the problem feel bigger than it was, and more urgent than it had been. In the mid-1930s, you see a concerted effort to standardize drug control at the state level, encouraging states to adopt uniform laws that treated cannabis as a controlled substance. And then, in 1937, the federal government makes its move. But notice how it does it. The federal government didn't simply announce, "Cannabis is illegal nationwide." Instead, it used a tool it already liked: taxation. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 didn't ban marijuana in the blunt way people imagine. It created a system of taxes and transfer stamps, and then made those stamps practically impossible to obtain. On paper, it was regulation. In practice, it was a de facto ban. If you needed a tax stamp to transfer cannabis, and the government rarely issued the stamp, then almost any transfer could be treated as a crime. That's how you build prohibition without saying the word prohibition. And once you do that, you don't just outlaw a plant, you create infrastructure. You create enforcement routines, paperwork, raids, arrest statistics, training manuals, court cases, budgets. And once those things exist, the system starts to protect itself because it now has something to lose. The next phase is equally important: controlling the narrative. The public image of cannabis in this era wasn't shaped by careful medical consensus. It was shaped by moral panic, sensational claims, and the power of repetition. And even when scientific pushback emerged, the machine didn't slow down. One of the most famous examples comes from New York City. In 1939, New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia commissions a serious scientific study on marijuana, and in 1944, the report is published. It pushes back against the worst claims, challenging the idea that marijuana use automatically leads to violent crime, that it causes inevitable physical addiction, that it turns users into instant criminals. And what happens? The report doesn't reset federal policy. It becomes a threat, an obstacle, something to be dismissed. Because by then, the point wasn't just, is cannabis dangerous? The point was, the prohibition system already existed, and systems don't enjoy being told they were built on exaggeration. Then, in the 1950s, the structure gets reinforced with something America loves: mandatory punishment. Congress passes laws that drastically escalate penalties, including for marijuana. The Boggs Act of 1951 sets mandatory sentences for drug convictions, including steep penalties for cannabis offenses. And in 1956, the Narcotic Control Act increases penalties further, expanding the federal government's enforcement tools and raising the stakes dramatically, even including extreme sentencing provisions in certain contexts. This is a pattern you'll see again and again. Once you create a prohibition framework, you tend to justify it by intensifying it. Because if the problem persists, the conclusion isn't, maybe the policy is wrong. The conclusion becomes, we're not being tough enough. By the 1960s, though, the machinery hits a snag. Not because the government suddenly changes its mind, but because of constitutional reality. The Marijuana Tax Act relies on paperwork that can force people to incriminate themselves. And in 1969, the Supreme Court delivers a major blow. In Leary v. United States, the court finds that key elements of the Marijuana Tax Act effectively violate the Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination. It's one of those moments where you might expect a reset. The original federal framework is undermined. The legal architecture is cracked. But watch what happens next, because this is where the built thesis becomes undeniable. The government doesn't retreat. It rebuilds stronger. In 1970, Congress passes the Controlled Substances Act, creating the modern scheduling system. And cannabis lands in the strictest category, Schedule 1. Officially, Schedule 1 means high abuse potential and no accepted medical use under federal law. But what's crucial here is that marijuana's placement wasn't treated as a settled, final scientific conclusion. It was also political and administrative, a way to keep cannabis tightly controlled while the new system took shape. And here comes another turning point. In 1972, a national commission, the Shafer Commission, delivers a report that essentially tells the country, we are misunderstanding this. It recommends that possession for personal use should not be treated as a criminal offense. a clear push toward decriminalization. And the federal government ignores it. That's not a small detail. That is the story. Because the 1970s offered a fork in the road. One path was public health and decriminalization. The other path was deeper criminalization and escalation. And America chose escalation. At this point, you can see Prohibition's logic fully formed. Cannabis prohibition is no longer just a law on a book. It's an institution. It's a political symbol. It's a way to signal toughness. It's a way to justify budgets. It's a way to police and prosecute. And now, it's deeply difficult to undo. Because undoing it would mean admitting that decades of policy were built on something other than medical clarity. But history doesn't stop. The states start to crack the facade. In 1973, Oregon becomes the first state to decriminalize possession of small amounts of marijuana. Not by declaring cannabis harmless, but by refusing to treat possession like a life-derailing crime. More states follow in various forms. And then the biggest state-level break comes in 1996. California voters passed Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, opening the modern era of medical marijuana laws. For the first time, a major state is not just decriminalizing possession, but allowing medical use despite federal prohibition. And that creates a new American reality. Two legal universes occupying the same territory. Federal law still says cannabis is Schedule 1. States begin treating it like medicine, and later like a regulated adult product. The federal government doesn't immediately crush the movement, but it doesn't surrender either. Instead, it improvises. Court battles reinforce federal authority. In 2005, the Supreme Court rules in Gonzalez v. Raich that federal power under the Controlled Substances Act can reach even locally grown marijuana intended for medical use under state law. In other words, the federal ban is still real, even if states are rewriting their own rules. And then, in the 2010s, you get the next shift. The rise of state-legal recreational cannabis and federal enforcement discretion. In 2013, the Justice Department issues guidance outlining enforcement priorities, signaling that in states with strong regulatory systems, federal resources may not focus on prosecuting every marijuana case. That doesn't legalize cannabis federally, but it does something culturally enormous. It teaches the public that prohibition is, at least in practice, negotiable. And once the public sees a law as negotiable, it becomes harder to treat it as sacred. Meanwhile, another thread appears, one that shows how complex this built system has become. In 2018, federal law carves out hemp, defined by low delta-9 THC, from the definition of marijuana under the Controlled Substances Act. So now the country has a cannabis plant that is legal in one form and illegal in another, based on chemistry thresholds and regulatory definitions. That's not just a policy choice. That's the sound of an old system trying to adapt without admitting it's obsolete. And by the 2020s, the federal government is stuck with a contradiction. A Schedule 1 drug that millions of Americans can purchase legally in their state. A prohibition framework that still exists, but is increasingly out of sync with reality. So what happens when reality and law drift too far apart? Eventually, somebody tries to change the law. In May 2024, the Justice Department proposes moving marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, a significant shift that acknowledges accepted medical use and a different assessment of risk. And as of late 2025, the federal government is still pushing to accelerate research and move the rescheduling process forward. Not legalization, but a formal step away from the strictest category. And that brings us to the final point, the one that turns this from a cannabis story into an American story. Cannabis prohibition wasn't inevitable. It was built. It was built with tax law tricks that functioned like bans. It was built with institutional incentives that rewarded escalation. It was built with propaganda and panic that shaped public perception. It was built with mandatory penalties that raised the cost of being caught. It was rebuilt when courts struck down parts of the old structure. And then, for decades, it was maintained not because it was scientifically airtight, but because it had become a system. And systems don't collapse just because they're wrong. They collapse when enough people decide they're no longer acceptable, and when lawmakers finally choose to dismantle what their predecessors constructed. So the question isn't just, why was cannabis prohibited? The deeper question is, what else in American life feels inevitable only because someone built it that way? And while you ponder that, click the subscribe button. Good things will be delivered to you weekly. Thanks for watching. I will see you next week, baby.